everyone and welcome to this video for Life on Earth. You should now know all about energy in the ecosystem and you should be able to pause the video and answer the question before I go over the answers. So the question is, the number of freshwater shrimps was found to have decreased dramatically. Predict the effect this will have on the number of dragonfly nymphs and microscopic algae. The answer is that we need to get rid of the freshwater shrimps. So if the freshwater shrimps decreased, the microscopic algae would increase because they have lost their predator, they've lost the thing that's eating them, so that would go up. And the dragonfly larvae would decrease because it's lost a food source, so that would go down. So we need to find a statement that says that. So the answer would be D, microscopic algae would increase and dragonfly nymphs would decrease. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If you struggled to get the answer, remember you can go back and watch the last video and the parts that you were struggling with as many times as you want to. Today we're going to be learning about Key Area 5 food production. If you want the worksheets to go with the video, remember to pause the video and go to Free Life on Earth 5 food production, 2 consumables and activities. The PowerPoint is found in PowerPoint and is called 5 food production. So today we're going to be learning about Area 5 food production, and our learning intention is to know what happens as a result of the increasing human population, to explain how fertilizers work and how they affect the ecosystem, state what pesticides are used for and explain how they affect ecosystems, to identify what alternatives can be used instead of fertilizers and pesticides. To be successful, you will need to be able to state that an increase in human population means an increase in food production. You should be able to label the nitrogen diagram and use this to explain how fertilizers work. You should be able to put the stages of the formation of algal bloom in order and explain how it affects the ecosystem. You should be able to explain what pesticides are and how they bioaccumulate in food chains. And you should be able to identify GM crops and biological controls as alternatives to chemicals. Firstly, let's look at what is happening to the human population. As you can see from the graph that's here, the human population is increasing at an alarming rate. But why is this a problem? Well, the more people you have, the more food that you need. So because of more people, it means that we need an increased food yield. So current estimates are that our food production rate needs to double by 2050. So pause the video and write down what you think is causing this population to increase. So why is the human population increasing so much? Before I go over the answer. So the answer is the human population has been able to grow exponentially very rapidly due to removal of the threat of predation, because we have guns so we can kill most things, so we don't usually get eaten. Medical advances, so we've got lots of different medical technology which is keeping us alive for longer. And developments in farming, so we've got a lot of machinery that helps us to grow crops, etc. So well done if you managed to get any few of them correct. If we have more people and need more food, it means that we need to use more land, so less space is available. This map shows the current risk for human food security across 197 countries. So how do we support the increase in population? How do we manage to get everyone food? Pause the video and write down what you think the solution to this is before I go over the answers. So we do this by shortening the food chain, increasing food yield through intensive farming or genetically modified crops, using fertilizers and pesticides. So fertilizers provide nutrients for crops to grow, and pesticides kill pests to stop them eating the plants. So both of these things increase food yield. So pause the video and try to answer the challenge question. Why does shortening the food chain, why is that beneficial if we want to support an increasing population? So try to answer that before I go over it. So the answer is, the shorter the chain, the more energy is transferred. Because remember, 90% of energy is lost at each stage. So this is all due to energy transfer. So the shorter the chain, the more energy you receive. So you'd receive more energy from eating the grain than you would do from eating the chicken. So what is intensive farming? Intensive farming is a modern way of farming that uses machines and chemicals. So chemicals are usually fertilizers and pesticides. And these are used in large amounts to produce large amounts of food quickly and cheaply. This type of farming can also be referred to as pasture farming. So it's where lots of animals are kept in small cages or small areas together, and monoculturing, where there's only one crop grown. So therefore, competing plants and animals are removed, so it means that they're safe, but this also reduces biodiversity at the same time because there's only one species. And the animals are kept inside so that they use less energy because they're not moving around or not using the energy as heat. But this also means that animals can get diseases easily and spread it to each other more easily. The advantages of intensive farming are that they increase crop yield, so they produce lots of crops, and they produce lots of cheap food, and farming is easier to manage as it's all one crop in one area. The disadvantages of intensive farming is that the use of chemicals pollutes the environment, the loss of natural habitats for plants and animals, and there's also a concern for animal welfare because they're all being kept inside and they have a high risk of getting diseases. So the other thing that was mentioned was genetically modified crops. Genetically modified crops are crops that have a gene inserted into them that's not their own gene. Genetic engineering can be used to increase yields by either boosting the food produced or by making the organism resistant to damage. We've already looked at genetically modified crops when we went over the video for genetic engineering. We might want to look at the genetic engineering video again. So you can make crops pest resistant, you can improve their nutrition, you can put pharmaceuticals in plants, so medicines, you can make them salt resistant, you can make them disease resistant, you can make them produce higher yields, you can make them fight remediation, you can make them tolerant to cold, tolerant to weed killer, tolerant to drought. There's lots of things that you can do by adjusting the genes of crops. The part of this that you need to know and learn is that increasing human population requires an increased food yield. This can involve the use of fertilizers and pesticides. Fertilizers provide chemicals such as nitrates which increase crop yield. Plants and animals which reduce crop yield can be killed by pesticides. So make sure you learn the summary of food production. So write it out over and over again, say it over and over again until you know it off by heart before you go on to the next part of this video. Why do you think nutrient recycling is important? Pause the video and put down what you think. So inorganic nutrients occur in limited quantities and therefore we need to reuse them or they would run out. The nutrient that we need to focus on is nitrogen. Nitrogen is an essential element in all organisms. It occurs in proteins and other nitrogenous compounds, for example DNA and chlorophyll. Let's have a look at how nutrient cycles work. So we have nutrients in our living organism. So when our living organism excretes waste or dies, so excrete waste just means going to the toilet, the nutrients in their dead body and waste are decomposed by bacteria and fungi, which are called decomposers. This then makes the nutrients available for use. The nutrients are then absorbed by living things and then the process then repeats all over again. We need to know how this happens in nitrogen, so let's have a look into how we recycle nitrogen. You need to learn about how nitrogen is recycled. So, nitrates dissolved in the soil water are absorbed into plants. Plants cannot directly absorb nitrogen, they have to get nitrogen from absorbing nitrates. Nitrates are used to produce amino acids, which are synthesized into plant proteins. Animals also cannot directly absorb nitrogen, so they must eat plants or other animals to obtain amino acids for protein synthesis. And fertilizers can be added to the soil to increase the nitrate content of the soil. So you need to write this out over and over again and say it over and over again until you know this paragraph before you move on to the next part of the video. So you need to know nitrates are dissolved in soil water, absorbed into plants. The nitrates are used to produce amino acids, which are synthesized into plant proteins. Animals eat the plants, or other animals obtain amino acids for protein synthesis. Fertilizers can be added to the soil to increase the nitrate content of the soil. So here is the nitrogen cycle. So we have our keyword there, which is nitrates. So our nitrates are dissolved in the soil, and then our plants absorb our nitrates in the soil, and then our plants use these nitrates to produce amino acids and then synthesize plant protein. Again, as I told you, nitrogen cannot get directly into the plant. Then our animals eat plants or other animals to get amino acids for protein synthesis. And then our animal dies and it also excretes waste. So that then creates nitrogen, and the bacteria and the fungi, which are decomposers, can then convert that into a product which bacteria can then further convert into nitrates, and then the whole cycle repeats itself. So make sure that you understand the nitrogen cycle and the nitrogen diagram before you move on to the next part of this video. Let's try this SQA question, which says that the diagram below shows some stages of the nitrogen cycle. And then for I it says name chemical X, and for II it says name what is responsible for converting organic remains to chemical X, and III, which is describe why nitrogen is needed by living organisms. So try to pause the video and answer the questions before I go over the answers. So the answers would be, well, chemical X is going into the plant, and we know that only one nitrogen compound goes into the plant, which would be nitrate. So well done if you managed to get that correct. Then it says name what is responsible for converting organic remains to chemical X, and we know that that is bacteria and fungi. So the dead organic matter being converted into our nitrates is by bacteria and fungi. Describe why nitrogen is needed by living organisms. Well, we know that nitrogen is needed to make amino acids and proteins. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If you didn't, then go back to the start of the video and watch it again. So fertilizers contain nutrients such as nitrates, which help plants to grow. Fertilizers can be added to the soil to increase the nitrate content of the soil. This is good because it increases crop yield, which means that it increases the number of crops. Let's see if we can answer this SQA question, which says a gardener treated the soil in the area where he planted vegetables with a chemical to increase yield. AI, the chemical added to the soil by the gardener contained nitrates. Give the general name for this type of chemical. And II, describe the use that plants make of nitrates. So try to answer the questions before I go over the answers. So the answers are that the general name of the chemical would be fertilizer, and plants need nitrates to make amino acids or proteins. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, then you need to go back and watch the video from the start. So how do fertilizers go from being a good thing that increases crop yield to where there is this algal green bloom stuff on the top of the water? So obviously this green stuff's algae. To where all of the fish are dead. So you should have looked at this in third year, so pause the video and write down what you think the fertilizers are doing. What happens is that the fertilizer can leach into fresh water, adding extra unwanted nitrates. This will increase algal populations, which can cause an algal bloom, which is the green layer that you see over the water. Algal blooms reduce light levels so that the plants underneath the algae cannot photosynthesize. This kills aquatic plants, so these dead plants as well as the dead algae become food for bacteria, which increases the bacteria number. Bacteria use up a large quantity of oxygen, which reduces oxygen availability for other organisms, which therefore decreases the biodiversity. So you need to pause the video and learn the effects of fertilizers on fresh water, and you need to be able to know each of the different stages and be able to put them in order. So make sure you know this before you move on to the next part of the video. Watch the film link about the effects of fertilizer on a river. You can pause the video and watch this now, or you can go back and do it at the end. Let's see if we can answer this SQA question, which says, which of the following could occur as a result of fertilizers leaching into a freshwater pond? So what happens to the algae population, the bacterial population, and the oxygen concentration? So pause the video and try to answer before I go over the answers. So we know that if you have an increase in fertilizers, it's going to increase the nitrate content, which is going to increase the algal population, and we're going to form an algal bloom, which causes the aquatic plants to die and algae to die, which then increases bacteria numbers. And then an increase in bacteria numbers will cause the oxygen level to decrease. So we've got increase, increase, and decrease. So the answer must be D. So well done if you managed to get that correct. It's sometimes easier to underline the right answer so you can keep track before you pick the letter. Another SQA question that we're going to try is, later in the year the gardener noticed that the algae in his pond had increased and now covered the surface of the water. He sampled the pond water over 5 weeks and measured its oxygen concentration and the number of bacteria present. The results are shown in the graph below. What name is given to the increased growth of algae in the pond? Explain why the increased growth of algae resulted in an increase in the number of bacteria. Using the information in the graph, explain why the increase in number of bacteria resulted in the population of goldfish in the pond decreasing. So pause the video and try to come up with the answers yourself before I go over them. The answer to number 1 would be an algal bloom. The answer to number 2 would be that the bacteria would have more dead algae to feed on, and also the algae will block the light for the aquatic plants, which will die, which bacteria can feed on too. And then the last answer would be that there would be less oxygen for the fish due to lots of bacteria using the oxygen up. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, then go back to the start of this video and watch it again. So how do we reduce the use of fertilizers? The way that we do this is by using genetically modified GM crops. This can be used to reduce the use of fertilizer and is an alternative. So genetic engineering can be used to increase yields by either boosting the food production or making the organism resistant to damage, like I said at the start. So whenever you are asked for an alternative method to fertilizer, you need to answer with GM crop. We should already know all about GM crops from the cell biology lesson on genetic engineering, but here is some revision. So genetically modified crops have a useful gene from another organism inserted into their cells. So examples of plants that are genetically engineered would be maize, which is resistant to insect pests, potatoes, which can be resistant to fungal blight, which we've looked at, and golden rice, which contains a high dose of vitamin A, which we've looked at, which prevents river blindness. So the advantages of genetically modified crops is that it allows farmers to decrease their use of chemicals without decreasing their crop yield, and it also reduces the quantity of crops lost. The disadvantage to genetically modified crops is that there is no guarantee that the crops will remain resistant to disease, and some people believe these crops carry risk to human health. This should be revision from genetic engineering, so if you have any issues with trying to fill in this table, then you need to go watch your video on genetic engineering. So try to copy out the table and fill in the missing blanks before I go over the answers. So the answers are that golden rice's gene addition, you don't need to know about the gene, but it's beta-carotene gene, and the advantage that you do need to know is that it can help prevent blindness. The disadvantage is that it can cause contamination, it could be harmful, and levels may not be high enough. Another genetically engineered product that you know about is the potatoes. So you've got a gene addition that you don't need to know, which is the Sanalum bulbocustum gene that I probably didn't say right. And the advantage to consumers is that it's blight resistant. The disadvantage is that it's harmful well, it can be harmful, and some new strains of fungi can now infect these variants. And the last one is tomatoes. So the gene addition is the antisense gene, and the advantage to customers is it prevents the softening and rotting of the tomatoes. It gives them a longer shelf life. And the disadvantage are that the tomatoes can become too delicate and their flavour can be altered. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, go watch the genetic engineering video. Now you're growing some strawberry plants because you're a farmer, but your green flies, which are also called aphids, keep eating your plants. How do you get rid of them? Because you don't want to lose money on these strawberry plants that you're growing. Pause the video and write down what you think that you should do before I go over the answer. So a solution to this would be to use a pesticide. So well done if you got that correct. So a pesticide is a chemical used to kill organisms that are in competition with the crop plant. So pause the video and write down some good things about pesticides and try to list some bad things about pesticides before I go over the answers with you. So the answers are that pesticides are good because they reduce competition, they get rid of crop pests, but the bad thing about pesticides is they can be washed into rivers and harm local ecosystems, and they can be potentially harmful to humans. The biggest problem that you need to know about is that pesticides sprayed onto crops can accumulate, so that just means build up, in bodies of organisms over time. And as they are passed along food chains, toxicity increases and can reach lethal levels. Therefore, the top consumer will always have the highest concentration of pesticide, and unfortunately humans are usually the top consumer. The build-up of this toxic substance in living organism is known as bioaccumulation. You need to know the word bioaccumulation, it's very important, and you need to make sure that you know this off by heart before you move on to the next part of the video. So your bioaccumulation is when your toxin builds up, and your toxin is going to build up, and pesticide is going to build up from your producer to your top consumer. So your top consumer will have the most and the highest concentration of pesticide, and your producer will have the least concentration of pesticide. An example of a pesticide that bioaccumulates is DDT, which was spread in countries like Africa, and it was spread everywhere to try to get rid of the Anopheles mosquito to stop the spreading of the disease malaria. So the pesticide DDT is known to cause a bioaccumulation. It was widely used in the 1950s and 1960s. DDT was sprayed onto plants and entered the food chain, where the contaminated plants were eaten by other organisms. It is now banned due to its harmful effects on biodiversity. It caused thinning of eggshells, meaning that chicks hatched before they were strong enough to survive. It has even been found in water ecosystems, and it has been found all the way in the tissues of penguins in Antarctica. It was quite a harmful pesticide. So this is a bioaccumulation of DDT. So in the water, it's not very toxic, but it builds up in the zooplankton, and then again in the small fish, and then the large fish, and then finally in the birds. So DDT concentration increased 10 million times when it reached the bird. So that is a lot. Let's look at an example of an SQA question on pesticides. So it says DDT can be sprayed onto crops to kill insects. It can be washed off the crop by rainwater and flow into rivers where it accumulates in food chains. A typical freshwater food chain and the concentration of DDT in each organism is shown below. So you've got your algae, stickleback, trout, and osprey. And it says which organism will have the highest concentration of DDT. So pause the video and try to write down which organism will have the highest concentration of DDT before I go over the answer. So we know that pesticides bioaccumulate, so the algae will have the least, then it'll build up to the stickleback, then it'll build up in the trout because the trout eats the stickleback, and then it'll build up in the osprey because the osprey eats the trout. So the one with the highest is going to be the thing at the top, which is your osprey. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, go watch the video again. So another question that you could get asked is with the same passage at the top, but this time it says which organism will have the lowest concentration of DDT. So pause the video and try to answer the question before I go over the answer. So the answer would be that the algae had the lowest DDT because it is the producer and it comes at the start of the food chain. So let's look at what an alternative to pesticides is. So an alternative to pesticides is a biological control. Biological controls are the deliberate use of natural predators to control pests in farming. So for example, ladybirds have been used to clear green flies, and that is an example of a biological control because the ladybirds eat the green flies as they're the predator to the green flies. So the advantages of biological controls is it reduces the effect of harmful chemical pesticides that may kill other organisms, and bioaccumulation does not occur. The disadvantages of biological controls are that it only affects small growing areas, and in some cases the natural predator becomes the pest because it might not have any predators itself. See if you can pause the video and answer the question which says state the term which describes the use of a predator as an alternative to pesticides. So the answer would be that this would be a biological control. So biological controls and GM crops may be used as alternatives to using pesticides. So for example, we have ladybirds that eat aphids. So ladybirds are the predator, so we could introduce them. We can introduce a virus to get rid of rabbits, which is called the myxomatosis virus. And we can introduce the cactus moth to get rid of the prickly pear cactus, which is a parasite. So let's look at these in more detail. So usually we would use a Torrance textbook to fill in the table, but let's do it together instead. So a predator that eats aphids such as green flies, so stops them eating cucumbers and tomatoes, etc. We should know the answer to this because we just went over it. It would be a ladybird, so well done if that's what you were thinking in your head. The myxomatosis virus was used to kill what? It was used to kill rabbits because it is a disease and it controls their numbers. And then we've got the cane toad that we've not looked at, but cane toad eats the cane beetle to stop their numbers. So what would that be? That'd be a predator. And the last one we're looking at is a parasite. So whatever it is lives and eats the prickly pear cacti until they destroy them, which controls the number of prickly pear cacti. And the answer would be the cactus moth. So well done if you managed to get that all correct. I would just learn one example of biological control, don't learn any more than that. So let's try to answer this next SQA question. So it says farmers use pesticides to kill insects which damage their crops. Describe an advantage that farmers might gain by planting the GM cotton plant rather than the unmodified variety. So try to answer this before I go over it. So the answer would be that there would be high yields without the need for pesticide control, or it would be not using pesticides, so there would be less environmental impact. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, then go back to the start of this video. You should now be able to do the food production key area past paper questions, life on earth exam practice questions, page 69 to 72, and the National 5 James Torrance textbook questions on page 199. We have now come to the end of the lesson. You should now be able to state an increase in human population means an increase in food production. Label the nitrogen diagram and use this to explain how fertilizers work. Put the stages of the formation of an algal bloom in order and explain how it affects ecosystems. Explain what pesticides are and how they bioaccumulate in a food chain. Identify GM crops and biological controls as being alternatives to chemicals. Well done if you can confidently do all of that. If you can't, then you will need to watch this video again. That is the end of this video tutorial. Woohoo! Thank you for listening.